and we are recording the session. And so I would like to introduce Eboni Zook, who teaches high school computer science and technology at the Baltimore Leadership School for Young Women. And she's a 2020-21 Equity Fellow with the Computer Science Teachers Association, which is a new effort, which we're really looking forward to getting some great materials from.
All right, thank you, Diane. Welcome everyone to this presentation, and hopefully you will be able to learn some information that helps you to make your computer science classroom more inclusive and more welcoming to our underrepresented students. So we're just going to get started. As Diane said, I teach computer science and technology at the Baltimore Leadership School for Young Women in Baltimore, Maryland. And again, my name is Eboni Zook. And our school is unique in that it is all young ladies or non-binary students. And we are 97% African-American students, about 50% students from under-resourced communities. So that is the makeup of our school. It is a middle school and high school. So we get our girls from 6th grade and then move them up in our school to be able to just build that relationship with them and their families and put them on the path to success and becoming a leader in Baltimore. I am a CSTA Equity Fellow, and I'm also a Code.org CS Fundamentals Facilitator. So I've either led or assisted in leading professional development for teachers throughout pretty much every district in Maryland, and some teachers from Pennsylvania. So just training teachers in the elementary version of their curriculum. And this is my 9th year as a K-12 educator. Okay, so what we will discuss and what the goals are for this presentation is that we want to define inclusivity in computer science education. We want to learn strategies and practices to make CS classrooms in any division more inclusive. And we want to reflect on some essential questions to contextualize the information from this presentation. All right, so what is inclusion? So and this definition comes from the Microsoft Guide to Inclusive Computer Science Education, which if you look in the chat and go to that link, that will show you the guide and different materials about inclusivity in computer science education that I use for this presentation. And so inclusion is creating learning environments that are accessible and welcoming of students' identities, backgrounds, differences, and perspectives without barriers or judgment. And this means actively attending to gender, race, ethnicity, ability, or socioeconomic status. And so I just read that definition so we would have shared understanding of what it means to have an inclusive learning environment. Okay, our first strategy is called Begin with Unit 0. So this idea comes from another Equity Fellow, Chastity Freeman, who was a 2019-2020 CSTA Equity Fellow. And in her workshop, she talked about the curriculum before you teach the curriculum, or the hidden curriculum that students need to learn before they even get into our computer science content. And I think often we as teachers, especially in the upper grades, assume that students come to us with these skills and with this knowledge and don't really teach it intentionally or attend to it. And so before I even get started in my curriculum, especially for this year, I started with academic skills, learning strategies, and teaching academic language to my students. And so what that looked like was teaching these skills in the context of computer science. And then in a couple weeks, I'm going to switch, and actually this week, I'm switching and teaching more computer science content and skills, and then integrating those academic skills within that. But in the beginning, I think it's important to teach these first so that all of your students are starting off on a level playing field. So some of the academic skills that I teach are writing effective paragraphs and even writing effective sentences, time management skills, presentation skills. And so one way I did that was I had the students look at the syllabus for the course and research some of the curriculum, and then make an infographic about that curriculum, about that unit, and then present that to their peers. And so before they even started on the research, we talked about presentation skills and speaking in a clear voice and making eye contact and making a visual graphic, directing your audience's attention. And so making sure we discussed those presentation skills before doing more content and projects where they have to have those presentation skills, but then doing it in a way where they could learn about the content through studying the syllabus and the different units, and also pairing that with creating an infographic. So they learned a lot of skills with just that one presentation. We often talk about in teaching, layering the learning. And so that project was a way for me to teach presentation skills and teach them about an infographic and teach them about what they're going to be learning about in the course. Some of the learning strategies that I teach in Unit 0 are they're helping them to identify their preferred learning style so they can be advocates for themselves to their teachers in terms of how they like to learn, taking notes, teaching how to study, how to use example text and example code, and then going over academic language. Often in teaching, again, especially in the more upper grades, we'll use words like analyze and critique and cite evidence, and we just assume that students know what those words mean. So I make sure to take the time to explain what I'm looking for and what those words mean. And, if I say compare and contrast, well, compare is looking at things, or what are the similarities between these two things? Contrast is what are the differences between these two things, and making sure the students understand that. I go over that to just make sure students understand what I want, so that when I'm grading, there's no confusion about what I'm looking for. And you can do that with a rubric in terms of showing students the result or deliverable that you want. But I find for myself that my students really don't read the rubrics. So probably a better way to do that is to create a checklist and to say, if you're comparing and contrasting, these are the things that you need to do, and make sure that they're using that checklist. But again, a rubric could also work if your students read your rubrics, but a checklist would also work with that as well. And so the essential question that I want to bring up with that strategy is, how can I equip my students with the academic skills that they need to be successful in a CS classroom? So just kind of thinking about what are the academic skills, what are the gaps that my students might have that might prevent them from being successful? So I'll give us maybe 30 seconds to think about that, and you can put your responses in the chat, or if you have a response now or an idea now that you would like to share out, feel free to do that. Yes, definitely. You got to start small with those steps and then kind of build on those skills. Okay, I'm going to go on to strategy number 2, which is decorate the classroom space with culturally relevant artifacts. So as we all know, and some of us more than others, space affects people. I remember one of the houses that we lived in, the previous owners had painted, I guess they liked fall colors because they painted like one room red and then they painted another room bright orange. And I just felt like super overwhelmed in those rooms because I'm a very sensory oriented person, and just those bright colors in the room all the time just kind of affected me. We either didn't have time to paint it or whatever, but I just remember feeling that way. So I like cool colors or like earth tones, but but as we know, space affects people. So you know, we need to make sure that our classrooms are spaces that are welcoming to underrepresented students, and also you know, express who they are. So one way to do that is to display posters of diverse students in computer science classrooms, display posters of diverse leaders in computer science and discuss what they achieved. For our younger learners, displaying books and magazines that feature diverse people in computer science. And lastly, providing some hands-on materials with which students can interact. And I know that seems a little weird to include that as a culturally relevant artifact, but I think that often underrepresented students are often told, you know, don't touch that, or don't do this, or don't do that. And there's a lot of no's that they hear in their life. And so if you have a CS classroom, you know, putting stuff out on display that they can touch and interact with, such as a class robot or used motherboard, an open CPU, or it's like a snap circuits kit, it does two things. One, it allows students to have tinker time, which is the way that computer scientists learn. They just experiment and work with stuff and work with code to learn it. And two, it's telling them, you know, this is your space. I want you to learn and experiment and have the freedom to work with the materials, but it's inviting students to understand that it's their space too, and that they're welcome to learn and that they belong. So the essential question that I would place with this strategy is, if an underrepresented student walked into my CS classroom, what would they see that would make them feel as though they belong there? And for your students who have low vision or visual impairments, you know, what do they hear? Again, what type of materials do you put out that they can touch and interact with that will help them to feel as though they belong there? So that's just a question to consider. Yes, yes, and that Kristen says that Tinker Time, that she loves that idea. That there was a student yesterday who said he needed to touch things to learn it. That helps our kinesthetic learners who need to touch things or who need movement to learn things. Having those materials out there really helps them to learn in their learning style, but feel comfortable experimenting and taking risks. Because as we know, in a computer science classroom, our students frequently take risks and need to become more comfortable with taking risks. All right, I'm going to move on to strategy 3, which is teaching computer science vocabulary and introductory skills. So this may sound really similar to strategy 1, but strategy 1 is more basic academic skills that can be taught or used in any content or discipline. And this strategy is more specific to computer science. For myself, and maybe you all have experienced this, when students take my computer science class, I teach foundations of computer science and computer science principles. It's the first time for many of them that they've experienced anything around computer science. So maybe they've played games, or maybe they had, you know, computer labs in their previous schools, but this is the first time that they're learning specifically about computer science. So understanding that, or having learned that, I try to, excuse me, be very specific about teaching the CS vocabulary and going over computer literacy and keyboarding and even the basic functions of a computer before I actually get into the content. And I do that to help them to feel confident when we engage with the content, and also to feel comfortable using those terms because they've heard them before, they've seen them before. So even before they, write their first program, they've learned what a program is. They've learned what an algorithm is. They've heard of HTML. They've seen different things. So it's just increasing your students' comfortability, and again, helping them feel more comfortable taking risks when they actually engage with the content. And so some of the CS vocabulary that I go over is software, hardware, operating system, algorithms, CPUs, RAM. We have a lot of, it's escaping me what these words are with just the letters, acronyms in computer science, and often students don't know what they mean. Like if you say OS, does your student know what that means? Does it mean an operating system type thing? So making sure you're going over the acronyms as well. Computer literacy, this is super important, especially for our students to understand, number one, how to do basic things on a computer, because often, my students are phone savvy, and so they'll have the Instagram and the Twitter profile and things like that. But then when you ask them to download or upload documents on a keyboard, they don't know how to do that. They'll do it on a phone, or they'll ask me, Ms. Zook, can I do this on the phone? I'll say, no, you have to do it on a keyboard. You have to learn how to do that, because there's going to be some things that you can't download and upload on a phone. And that's going to be a skill that your employer is going to expect of you to be able to download and upload documents. Research and media literacy, making sure our students know how to research and finding reputable sources and sources that are unreputable, and how to differentiate between that. Just recently, I taught a unit or a group of lessons on digital citizenship from Common Sense Education, which is a part of Common Sense Media. And they have an excellent resources for digital citizenship. I mean, it has lesson plans, it has the digital the Google slides, it has the worksheets and activities. So if you're looking for just a pre-made curriculum to teach your students digital citizenship skills, I highly recommend Common Sense Education. Troubleshooting. Do your students know what to do if they're having problems with a program or with a document? I've had to tell students, okay, try to refresh it, or turn your computer off and turn it back on. Just making sure they have those basic troubleshooting skills. And then how to enable and disable pop-ups. And I mentioned that because during our testing season in the beginning of the school year, one of the testing, I don't know, I can't remember if it was iReady or IMAP or whatever, for it to work, you needed to be able to disable pop-ups. And so, for some of our students, they're not doing as well on standardized tests because they don't know how to enable or disable pop-ups. And that's going to be important as more testing happens from home, making sure that they have enough computer literacy skills to be able to do well on those standardized tests, and that's not the thing that's keeping them from doing well. I'm going to try to check the chat as we're talking.
If there's any real questions, I'll convey them to you if you'd like.
Yes, that would be great. Thank you. Okay, and then keyboarding, keyboard shortcuts. Actually, I taught that today, students using keyboard shortcuts, because we know in programming, there's code that you want to repeat or copy, and just making sure that they know those keyboard shortcuts to make it easier so that they're not retyping every line of code, but that they know, okay, I can copy it, I can cut, I can, manipulate the code and the text just using the shortcuts. Taking screenshots, typing, these types of skills. And then again, the basic functions of a computer input, processing, storage, and output, making sure they understand how the computer works, the external parts and the internal parts. And also making sure they understand, computing is about information and the transfer of information and solving problems. So the essential question with that strategy is, how can I teach my students the foundational CS knowledge they need to be successful in my CS course? All right, I'm going to move on to strategy number 4, which is probably one of the most important, addressing the digital divide. As we've seen and experienced with COVID and the closing of schools, our underrepresented students are probably the most vulnerable in terms of not having the technology and computer resources that they need to do well in school and to have access to our computer science courses. So I think, the best way to address that is just kind of to be direct and, in a discreet way, asking your students if they have access to computers or laptops or technology at home, but then also understanding that your students may not have access to high speed and reliable internet. In the city, there have been days where, there's been like a almost citywide kind of shutdown or malfunction of the internet because it's run by Comcast and they don't have fiber optics. We don't have FiOS in a lot of these under-resourced neighborhoods. And so, making sure you understand that it's not always just about the technology, but it's also, oppression in terms of geography, like with companies not building the infrastructure that these neighborhoods need to have high-speed internet to offer to families and to students. And so one way to approach that is, does your school, of course, when we're in person, but is your school able to loan technology to students or have technology available before or after school for students? I know in Baltimore City, we have some learning centers where students can go to, we're still distance learning, but there are some learning centers that are open that students can go to use computers and be with teachers or proctors who can assist them with their schoolwork. Can your district partner with local entities like libraries or recreation centers or nonprofits to provide technology access to students? And then maybe for your older students, is there a way to make your curriculum and instruction phone accessible? And even for your younger students, there's more and more digital tools that are coming out that are, understanding that students use their phones for practically everything. Is there a way that you can tweak your curriculum a little bit to make it accessible by phone? Because there may be times where the internet goes out and students only have access to the internet on their phone, or the computers break down, so are there ways we can make it more accessible using the technology that students have? And so a question with that is, do my students have the technology and internet access they need to be successful in my course? And if not, what resources are available to them? Okay, the next strategy I want to go into is, how do we make CS education inclusive for special populations? And so I just wanted to highlight our students with IEPs and 504s. What are some ways we can make our curriculum more accessible and meet their needs? So number one is assistive technology and accessibility features. So often there's accessibility features within the curriculum or on the computer that maybe we're not as familiar with. And so it's a matter of familiarizing ourselves with those features and making sure our students and their families are familiar with those features. And two, using assistive technology. So every school district must either receives funds from the state or federal government for assistive technology, or must allot funds for that kind of technology, because that's a part of IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that says if a student with an IEP or 504 requires assistive technology, they must be provided with that. So that's information that, you know, you as a teacher or an administrator or the student's parents can advocate for themselves with that information and say, well, it's on my student's IEP, they need to have access to this technology, because every district should have funds available and technology available for assistive technology. I know the state of Maryland definitely has those resources available. So if your student can't get it from your school, they should absolutely be able to get it from the district or from from Maryland State Department of Education. Using Chrome extensions and accessibility tools in the curriculum. So there's different Chrome extensions that I know we have access to in our district, which is like read to text and speech to text. And so making sure you're aware of those extensions and those features for students with special needs, I think is one of the biggest issues, just making sure teachers are aware of them and get trained in how to use them. And then lastly, you can invite your special educators in your building and district to attend some computer science education PD with you. I know sometimes it's for myself as a computer science teacher, if I'm going to my special educator, it can kind of feel like a shot in the dark in terms of what they recommend to me to make my curriculum more accessible. But then I got to thinking, oh, well, if she actually attended this with me, that would help her to understand how to consult with me and coach me and what strategies would be most effective for my course and for my curriculum. And then also for myself, I just kind of took it upon myself to take some special education courses so that I would learn the strategies and methods for teaching students who have special needs.
That's great. I mean, both Kristen and I were saying that sounds like such a good idea, both to learn more ourselves and to invite the special educators to take a part of a course and just see how it works and give us some ideas. I like that.
Yeah, and I think there's even, so let's say your special educator, she's like, I just don't have time for that. There's asynchronous courses and, you know, trainings that you can send to your special educator just so that they get a basic understanding. Because I know our content is so specialized. Like, I'm the only CS teacher, technology teacher in my building. And so nobody knows my content except for me. But sending my special educator and even some of my administrators trainings or asynchronous trainings that to help them get a basic understanding of what I teach, you know, could really be helpful. And so an essential question here is, what changes could be made in my school to make CS education more accessible to students with IEPs and 504s? Okay, and so now I'm going to move on into inclusive education for our English language learners. So for my school, we don't really have any ELL students, but I know that in Baltimore City and in many school districts, the population of English language learners is growing, and the need for teacher resources in terms of making our content accessible to ELL learners is very much needed. So, you know, if it's not a reality at your school yet, it probably will be in the next 3 to 5 to 10 years. Like, it's, you know, the population is just growing. So one of the ways we can support our learners, our ELL learners, is for looking for digital curriculum with embedded language translation to assist students. I know that the code.org curriculum resources, they have the embedded language translation. So again, Diane is like shaking her hand. I haven't really had the opportunity to use it, but they say, you know, at every training, maybe it's not the greatest, but sometimes those resources are available. Another thing you can do is use peer programming. And so peer programming is when you have two students sharing one computer, and one is the driver working with the mouse and actually doing the steps on the computer. And then one is the, I forget what the other term is, but they're telling the student, you know, what to do and where to go and things like that.
Driver and navigator. That's
Yes,
the popular term.
Yes, driver and navigator. And you can pair students who speak the same native language, but then also maybe one of the students is more proficient in English. And then that way, the student who needs more support can learn from the student who's a little further ahead. And with that partnership, you're teaching them collaboration, you're teaching them compassion. You know, you can do some SEL, social and emotional learning training with that. But that's a way for students to support each other as peers and to learn from each other. I mean, I think some of the best moments in my classrooms have been when students are learning from each other and teaching each other. And so that's one way to support your learners. And then another way is to provide scaffolded support in the form of visual images and directions to support your student learning. I think especially for our youngest learners and even for older learners, helping them to be independent by giving them like visual instructions is really going to help them build their confidence in their ability to access the curriculum and be successful in the curriculum. And it just provides a way for them to learn what they should be doing through visuals. And then lastly, asking your school or district to host a family code night, you know, whatever you want to call it, code night, intro to coding night, but then make that accessible to families, because as the families become familiar with what computer science concepts are and vocabulary are, they share that with their students, but they also encourage their students to pursue those classes more and engage with the content more. And then, you know, as we learned in the general session, you know, there's a lot of misconceptions about what computer science is and who can learn it. And so by having a family code night, you kind of, you know, dispel that myth and help families to know that anyone can learn to code, and that it's accessible to everyone. And we want all of our students to learn this and have access to this information. And so an essential question here is, what changes could be made in my school to make CS education more accessible to students who are English language learners? And so finally, I just wanted to share with you an application of culturally responsive computer science. So one of the projects in the code.org curriculum was to propose an application to solve a problem in your school or community. And this was a really great conversation starter with my students in terms of the problems that they're seeing in their community in Baltimore City, or maybe in their specific neighborhood. So just a way to help them think about, you know, how does this computer science, how can it affect me? You know, is it even relevant to my situation, to my community? I think a lot of times some of the ideas can seem really abstract and like, how is this useful in my day-to-day life? But just helping students to bridge that gap between their daily lives and what's happening in their community, and ways computer science or technology can solve those problems or address those problems. And so I broke students up into small groups and had them, you know, brainstorm or think about problems in their community. And one of the groups came up with the problem of youth unemployment. And then, you know, through a series of steps in the project and going through the problem solving process, they came up with the solution of designing an app that can connect teenagers to summer job opportunities and internships in Baltimore. And so through this project, they identified a problem in their community, but they also identified a way that they themselves could help solve it. And, you know, and it empowered them to think about, you know, okay, so what are some other issues in my community or even in our school that technology can be applied to help solve or remediate that problem. And so the essential question here is, what could inclusive CS education look like in my context? So you may have, you know, different populations of underrepresented students. You may have more ELLs, or you may have more students from under-resourced neighborhoods, or you may have more students who identify as GLBTAQ. You know, so what does that look like in your context in terms of making your space and even your school more inclusive for underrepresented students? And then some of the resources, I just wanted to leave you with a resource page. There's curricular resources and networking resources with NSBE, which is the National Society of Black Engineers. There's the Microsoft Guide to Inclusive Classrooms, which again is in the folder, and the link for the folder is in the chat. And then there's the CSTA, Computer Science Teachers Association, and they normally put out different resources on equity, different articles, blogs, things like that, that provide teachers with, you know, resources or trainings, or help you to connect with people who are thinking about and doing research and who are experts on equity in computer science. So that is my presentation. So I think I'm going to stop sharing.